Hello, hi, it's Jimmy Nguyen, founding president of Bitcoin Association. We're the global organization that supports Bitcoin SVs, blockchain, and digital currency. It's one of the main competing chains of Bitcoin. Welcome to another episode of Blockchain Policy Matters, our web series where I talk to lawmakers and policy leaders across the world who are shaping the future of blockchain and digital assets. Today, I'm very pleased to have as our guest another U.S. Congressman, Bill Foster from Illinois. He is one of the co-chairs of the U.S. Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which we'll talk about. And in the 117th Congress, Representative Foster is serving on the Committee for Financial Services, where he is chairman of the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. And he also serves on the Committee for Science, Space, and Technology. As we'll learn, he is really the science tech guy and blockchain guy in Congress. In fact, he describes himself as Congress's only blockchain programmer. We'll learn all about that. Congressman Foster, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here. Although I sometimes introduce myself as representing 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the U.S. Congress. And
yes.
I worked for 25 years. I designed high energy particle physics accelerators and particle detectors. And so actually I guess the last of the giant machines in the United States was one I invented and led the teams that built it. But, you know, along that career, I designed 10 integrated circuits, and I'm probably the only member of Congress who has designed and built a 100,000 ampere superconducting power transmission line. So I don't want to overclaim. There may be others.
I think you're the only one. Would you describe yourself as the most technologically adept or savvy congressman?
Well, there are always holes in your technical knowledge, and when we go deep into biology, then I lose my bearings very quickly. But in the hard sciences, I think I have a pretty good grounding, all the way from fundamental field theory at Harvard when I went to grad school to a lot of technology, the kind you didn't need to design and build integrated circuits or large pieces of hardware.
So what made you interested in physics?
Well, I think it's there's almost every physicist with the smartest kid in their class, and there's an almost universal experience among physicists where they say, mommy, daddy, they realize they're the smartest kid in the class, and they wonder if they're the smartest kid in the world. And they go, mommy, daddy, who is the smartest person in the world? And they say, well, Albert Einstein. Oh, what did Albert Einstein do? Oh, he was a physicist. Oh, I'm going to be a physicist too. Okay, and then somewhere along your career, you go on, and then realize, you look around the classroom, realize you're not in the top of the class, and maybe only in the middle. And I sort of hit that in Harvard grad school when I saw these brilliant people destined to have great careers in theoretical physicists, and I realized, okay, I'll be a pretty good experimental physicist, and had a great career there.
Now, tell us how you got interested in blockchain technology in the digital asset world, because it's very hot now, but you were probably one of the first in Congress to pay attention to it.
There's some miraculous things about cryptography. Public key cryptography is, I think, one of the miracles of, it's not clear whether God had a choice as to whether or not to make that possible. And when the first time you hear about it, you say, okay, that can't work, that you can, publish a public key and really have it work the way it works. And so I, 30 years ago, I spent that afternoon saying, yep, this will really work. And these one-way mathematical functions actually, and there's a large class of things like this. It's also become important again because Congress is putting a lot of money into quantum, with one of the main justifications being that it has the potential to be able to undo some of these one-way functions that are fundamental to cryptography. And if that happens after a class of cryptography has been deployed, it's a huge national security threat. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what exactly it means to be a quantum safe cryptographic technique. which is still unclear to me,
Hmm.
but is very important. And so, when we start putting a lot of money in things like that, you have to look. Also on the Financial Services Committee, this is gradually becoming more and more important over time. We had the hearings with the Facebook Libra proposal, where you sort of had Facebook and the Libra Association talking out of opposite sides of their mouth, having to do with, for example, whether they'd allow self-custody, which is sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of, will you allow anonymous transactions or not? And so Zuckerberg was saying, oh, no, it'll all be traceable and well-regulated. And the Libra Association said, no, we're going to allow self-custody, and you can't have it both ways. And so, being able to just at least understand the logical choices that are faced by Congress is the starting point for deciding the policy choices about, whether or not you want to have untraceable, high volumes of untraceable transactions or not.
There's a lot to unpack there. So I'm glad you raised this question about quantum computing and whether or not it can remove the security of public-private key pair cryptography. You've been studying that clearly. What do you think the United States, from a policy perspective, should do with respect to the governance of the future of blockchain as well as quantum computing to balance the need for quantum computing innovation with the need to ensure the security of current cryptography?
Well, if I told you everything that's going on, I'd have to kill you.
Please don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is it is an existential national security threat if someone broke the cryptographic techniques that are currently in use. It's going to cause a lot of grief to everyone from the Federal Reserve on down, and that a lot of things that people are assuming are private will not be. And so it's a high stakes game trying to understand if we can do this or not. And a bunch of smart people are thinking about it, and they publish some of what they do. And I'm sure that that's true in the mirror image too, in other countries. And so, one of the fundamental missions of the intelligence community is to avoid technological surprise, of which you can't imagine a better example than our enemies discovering how to undo the cryptographic techniques we're using.
You also mentioned this issue about anonymity of transactions, and I'll tell you that our association in the BSV ecosystem globally fully supports the idea that anonymous transactions are bad because they, of course, can breed illegal activity. Our view of it is that at least the Bitcoin blockchain provides pseudonymity. The transactions are pseudonymous, sort of like an IP address, as opposed to full anonymity. I know you've remarked recently about the need, in your view, for courts in the United States to have some power to be able to reverse transactions. I want to actually talk about that. Is it that you really need to reverse transactions that are bad, or is it that you just need a mechanism to be able to move, let's say, coins that have been stolen or hacked back to their rightful owner or to the government?
Yeah, you need, well, and then there's the more complicated situation where someone steals your coins and then immediately they trickle onward. There's a very evolved set of law on this. If you rob a bank with cash, and then you go and stop at McDonald's and buy a hamburger, and then the cops come around later and say, hey, the question is, can they recover that cash from the McDonald's who received a payment? And the answer is McDonald's, I believe, I'm not a lawyer, but it's my belief that McDonald's gets to keep that as long as they had the belief that it was legitimate cash. If, on the other hand, they were a fencing operation who launders money, then they cannot keep it. And so it's a very evolved set of law, and I think we're going to need that in the crypto domain as well, because they're very analogous situations where someone drags you into an alley, puts a gun to your head, says, get out your cell phone and transfer all of your crypto assets to my cell phone, and then immediately transfers them out. Under what circumstances can you go to the police and a trusted court system and say, I want my money back or my crypto assets back? And I think that, it's something we're going to have to face. The big difference you see in crypto assets and cash and fixed assets is the difference in mobility. For example, I've never heard of ransomware where, you're screen says, okay, all your files are locked up, and I want you to transfer your real estate holdings to me, all right? And that would not work because the real estate holdings are traceable, and you can go back and you can go to a court and say, I know that I had to, sign over my, my title to this, but in fact, it was a fraudulent or transaction. And so cash is an intermediate state, and but the preferred thing for things like ransomware are crypto assets, simply because there is no control point. Even for cash, if you're going to smuggle cash across a border, there's a control point where you have to hide it in your luggage. And that doesn't obviously exist for crypto assets. And so you have to distinguish the utility of crypto assets having to do with convenience with one having to do with anonymity. And so I'm a big fan of the convenience and efficiency aspects, not so much of the anonymity. There's also something that should be thought about separately, having to do with the sort of pseudonymous thing that you referred to. If you look at how stock trading, electronic stock trading takes place, if you're making a bid or offer at an exchange, or you don't know who is on the other side of that bid and offer. You just know that it's been posted at that price. And so, and I believe even after the trade takes place, you simply know, the public knows that this trade took place at this price without knowing necessarily the participants in that. And so on the other hand, the regulator knows everything. And the regulator has to know everything if they're going to prevent things like wash trades. Wash trades are when you establish a fake price for an asset by buying it back and forth from yourself under fake names. And I am told that is not a rare thing in crypto assets, that the prices are established. And if you follow it through, how do you actually prevent that? You need to have a regulator who sees the true identities of all participants in that. I don't think there's a logical alternative to that. And then you said, wow, that regulator, if you're going to prevent things like wash trades, that regulator has to have a tremendous amount of very sensitive information. It's got to be someone you trust to do that. And then I think that's really the advantage of the free democracies of the world as a place where this will be domiciled. That if you end up getting in a fight with a regulator, I think most people would prefer that regulator be based in one of the free democracies of the world rather than, for example, China. And so you're going to have your choice of having a Wild West unregulated market with all sorts of fraudulent activities going on, lots of criminal activities, or have a seriously trusted third party, which is sort of an anathema to a lot of the Bitcoin community. But I think is, really ultimately those are the logical alternatives. Then you can also have a lot of, for example, on the Bitcoin, on the blockchain, there you can have one person can operate multiple wallets, and so you don't know, and so it may be that's an allowable thing, that when you buy or sell something, you might not know who that is, as long as there is a regulator. The situation is also different when you have volatile assets like Bitcoin, where there is a market to be regulated. You have to be careful of wash trades, compared to things like stable coins or central bank digital currencies that are by design stable in price. So you don't have to worry about wash trades. It makes no sense to go and sell yourself a bunch of digital dollars, for example, because they're $1 before or after you make the sale. And so that there may be a different set of rules for volatile or non-volatile assets. And I think that Bitcoin and things like that are just the first of a class of digital contracts that are also going to be big. And the law has to anticipate how you deal with digital contracts, because if you say, okay, we're going to have all of these rules relating to currency, but allow arbitrary digital contracts, then you will simply have digital contracts where people synthesize the ownership of crypto assets, and you'll be back where you started. So I think you have to look at this holistically in terms of the regulation. And one of the first things you're taken to is the identity of participants, which is something I'm very involved in right now. If you agree that ultimately you want these things to be legally traceable, then you say, okay, how do you authenticate yourself as a legal participant in this? And then you come around very quickly to the need for a trusted digital identity. And it has to be not only you have to prevent it from being fraudulent and from someone being able to impersonate you. You also have to limit or prevent people from operating multiple identities. For example, in the United States, the way most identity fraud takes place is that someone gets a driver's license in 4 different states under 4 different names, and then proceeds to establish a credit history and onwards. And so this, to prevent that, there is not really an alternative to have once in your life someone present themselves to a trusted authority, a government, authenticate themselves as a citizen, the way you have to do sort of for your real ID compliant driver's license in the United States, and authenticate yourself, present your birth certificate, sworn testimony from people that have known you since kindergarten. And whatever it is, to get a list of people, of citizens of a country, then you have to biometrically dedupe that against all other citizens to make sure that you are not establishing multiple identities, and which is also part of the real ID thing. And then you have to deal with a bunch of very sensitive things, like what you do about undocumented people, which is very politically fraught in both the United States and the EU, because if it makes it impossible to operate. And then you have to deal with even more sensitive things, like what you do with the witness protection program, which is essentially government-sponsored identity fraud. And that's why you have to trust, if you're going to have interoperable sets of identity systems in the EU, which are recently announced, and that there's going to be EU digital citizenship. And I think, I hope that the United States goes to something similar to that. And then the next step would be to have them interoperate. That means that we're going to have to somehow have a way that we will get other trusted countries to let them know, well, it looks like that's a fraudulent identity, but that's actually the witness protection program. So just back off. And so sharing your list of people in the witness protection programs with some countries might be easier than other countries. And so, there's a bunch of very fraught in international negotiations that have to do simply with establishing a way to authenticate yourself as a single legally traceable person. And then the policy decisions on what you'll apply them to.
Well, you have laid out why there's so much complexity to this digital asset and blockchain world, because it's not just about the coins themselves. There's all these issues. In fact, you recently introduced a piece of legislation, the Improving Digital Identity Act, to address this question of how the United States needs to tackle digital ID, because, as you mentioned, the European Union is further ahead in plans to create a EU digital identity. We don't have that same approach yet in the United States. What do you think the US needs to do in order to actually be able to implement some type of national digital identity program?
Yeah, well, the first thing is to come up with a way of getting a unique list of participants. The United States is the only club I know that doesn't have a list of its members, but we in fact don't, and it's partly by design. There is a lot of sort of self-image of the United States as we're the land of the frontier, where you can go and restart your life. All right, and so just go to Montana under a new name, and I don't care if you're a child rapist, you can just restart your life and walk away. Okay, I think that the US public has sort of moved away from that we really want to have. We want to have a society where you can make sure when someone says, I want to be a teacher, that you have a way to do meaningful background checks that can't be bypassed by identity fraud. And so that's a limitation on freedom. There's no question about it, but I think it's one that, given the mobility of people and really the heightened expectations for safety among people, that I think that's trying to prevent terrorism, for example. It's very hard to do that when people can operate multiple identities. And so this is, it's a change in culture. There's no question about it. But I think it's one where the public is ahead of the politicians on it.
Well, one thing I wanted to emphasize to you is that our blockchain ecosystem, we support one of the competing chains of Bitcoin, but we're very different than a lot of the other early Bitcoiners who are much more anti-government, shall I say, or viewed Bitcoin as anti-bank. Our philosophy is for this technology to grow to global adoption. Governments and big businesses need to get comfortable with the use of Bitcoin, which includes the ability to have KYC and AML compliance, to be able to trace transactions back to actors, both good and bad. And
right.
that's
and something stronger than the existing KYC AML, which has a number of, ultimately it's going to have to be. It's going to have to be stronger than that, including on the identity thing. One of the shameful things about the United States is we allow these anonymous shell corporations, which are just all sorts of abusive practices happen through those. And we're in the process, I hope, of getting rid of them and joining the rest of the world so that you actually take responsibility. Similarly, many, I think most countries have land registries where you actually know in a legally binding, unambiguous sense who owns the property next to you. That it's simply over time become more and more not okay with the American public to know that some farmer just had, some Chinese firm buy the land next to their property is not okay with them. They want to know who owns what in this country in terms of real estate. And I think that's something, again, the United States is behind. And when we get an unambiguous legal digital identity, then that's the starting point for talking about a land registry that's actually traceable to individual people, and will become important over time.
I'm glad you brought that up because a number of people view blockchain technology as one source of solution for managing ID, right? Doing it on a blockchain-based application. But it requires a lot of participants, government, private enterprise participants. Do you think that's possible in the United States where we don't really have a national ID system compared to other countries?
I think it's going to be difficult. I think the use of the blockchain to maintain your ID ecosystem, has the problem that I've alluded to, having to do with witness protection programs, or these poor people who were former Soviet spies that were attempted to be assassinated in England. And so, if I don't know how the Russians tracked them down, I would not be amazed if they found it through their online transactions. And it's very hard to do that unless you can have, you can go back and edit and generate a fake digital trail for people. And if everything is recorded on the blockchain, that's, cryptographically impossible. And so it's one of the downsides of using the blockchain as the trusted source of digital identity, because maybe we'll want to make it somewhat less trustworthy under some national security situations. So it's just one of the very complicated details that you get into when you try to design a real system.
Let's cover one other major topic, which is central bank digital currencies. They're a hot topic around the world. I know a lot of governments are exploring them. What do you think the United States needs to do with respect to creating a Federal Reserve, U.S. digital dollar? I know you've remarked about it recently. Give us your thoughts.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, I have French Hill, who's my favorite Republican to collaborate on a lot of these things. Is he and I, probably 3 years ago now, started pestering the Federal Reserve. Hey, China is doing this. We have to be able to answer that. There's a long-term threat to the primacy of the dollar, both in use in transactions internationally, but also as a reserve, ultimately as a reserve currency. Though there's a semi-separate set of issues there. China is very explicit about trying to make the Chinese digital currency the standard currency of their Belt and Road project. So we can't just stand back and let this happen. Then there's also some observations like when you make a commercial transaction, a consumer makes a commercial transaction, the credit card companies or someone like them, scrapes off 2 or 3%. And that number in China is about 0.2%. All right. And so why is this? And part of it is that they've gone to what I believe is just an accounts-based system with a handful of participants. But I think the government is clearing and observing every transaction in that, which is creepy to a lot of people. If you design a central bank digital currency correctly, you can set it up so that, for example, if the Federal Reserve clears all payments, or at least people have the option of just saying, I want to pay you $10. I send a message, I authenticate myself to the Federal Reserve and authenticate a transfer from my account to your account of $10. Then it's possible that the Federal Reserve only knows that at this point in time, this account transferred that account, and they don't know that I just bought underarm deodorant or whatever it was and start monetizing that, which is very different when you sign in with Google or sign in with Apple or you name it. Then they immediately start hoovering up all the data and all of the transaction data and monetizing it, which I think people are a lot less comfortable with that. They also understand, most people, that under some circumstances, the government can get access to all of the commercial data that is being collected by these people and by these companies. And so I think that most people will end up being more comfortable with a transparent, legally based government entity like the Federal Reserve as being the single entity that actually has access to the information. Now, there are two classes of access that you have to consider. One of them is when you prove that a crime has taken place, and then you go to a judge and say, I'm sorry, I have to know. Here's the proof the crime took place. Here's the proof that that I am a participant in that. I'm the victim, and I want you to unmask. Tell me who the perp was. And so under that's something where there's a transparent legal mechanism to do that, and a permanent record that this data has been accessed, which I think is going to be important. In countries like some of the Scandinavian countries, in Estonia, there is a record that that individuals can see of who has accessed their data. This is a little bit difficult to. I don't believe you can cryptographically guarantee that this is taking place. You have to trust, the programmers to make that the case. But if it's audited well, and so that people really have a fair amount of trust and know that when your data is being accessed and why, then I think that they will become more comfortable with having a transparent and government-based access, at least to the fact that I transferred money to you at this date, which is the minimum thing that the government has to collect.
So let's wrap up by talking about, we've talked about many of the concerns with the growth of blockchain technology and digital assets. What are the good uses that you see blockchain technology can bring to the world, and how is the Congressional Blockchain Caucus helping to shape policy to bring out the good parts?
Yeah, well, I think that things like land registries are a perfect example of things where you just want an immutable record. So when someone sells you the Brooklyn Bridge, you want to know, you'd be able to look at the blockchain, figure out, okay, does this person actually own the Brooklyn Bridge? What exactly is the footprint of the Brooklyn Bridge that you purchased along with it, and so on and so forth. What are the easements on the Brooklyn Bridge? And so this is, I think, the killer app. There's lots of things having to do with a lot of the concerns that I've been sort of focusing on here disappear if they're very low value things. So that if you're just, like you're clicking on something and you want to pay, they read a pretty good article and you want to pay them a half a penny for writing that nice article, micropayments. Yes. That would be something where what's at risk is small enough that you can tolerate a large amount of you'll still have to deal with click fraud, and I'm sure soon enough people will be money laundering by massive click fraud from country A to country B, but that probably can be made detectable enough that it won't become big. And so for small value transactions, for things like supply chain security, I think that's one where there really could be a killer app early. Just when you buy something, if you call it up on the screen and you say, this product, they're pretty much equivalent, but this product was made 85% of the value added came from a country that respects the rule of law and doesn't abuse workers. And this one only 40%. And the 60% of it came from countries that abuse workers. You know, I would even pay a little bit more, and I think most people would. And so that blockchain potentially allows you to report that. It will travel with the product as it flows through and has value added.
The source of origin. Source of origin.
Yeah, the source of origin and some of the details are there. So it's not just, this is a single country, because if you look at an iPhone, you know, people say, oh, it comes from China. Well, actually, no. The great majority of the value added. Places, yes. Yeah. And so it'd be interesting to say, okay, here's an iPhone and here's some different phone. And you say, okay, the iPhone, 75% of it comes from countries that respect the rule of law. And this other one, only 20%. You know, that could be a big factor. And blockchain, together with certified inspectors and auditors, because if someone can't just claim that they don't use child labor, they have to have a trusted authority come in and audit them and do snap inspections to make sure they actually don't use child labor. And so that there's an infrastructure around that could be tied together with blockchain.
Well, I'm glad you summarized a lot of those, because that's exactly the type of usage we're trying to build with our BSV blockchain ecosystem, because we're massively scaling to allow micropayments, take advantage of a public ledger so that there's more honesty to the information and you can trace. But as you mentioned, it doesn't replace the human touch, right? The data that goes into a blockchain is only so good as the human decisions and actions that lead to it. But I think you've summarized well some of the great use cases of blockchain technology.
And the ID, you know, this auditor, right? This auditor who's going to audit and make sure you don't use child labor, right. They have to have a digitally traceable ID. And so the starting point is for that auditor to authenticate himself as someone that we can go after if he's lying about child labor.
Well, that's a great way to end.
It's a great frontier. Yeah. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about blockchain as a technology.
Yeah, and I think you've really helped to hone in on why so much of the power of blockchain technology in the future will begin and depend on strong identity systems that can be allow people not just to trace where things come from, but to test the credibility and authenticity of where data and actions come from on a blockchain. I want to really thank you for taking time to speak with us today, Representative Foster, and we look forward to engaging with your office and so many other members of Congress as you help shape policy that affects this industry and technology sector. And I want to thank you for being interested in this space and really leading the way in trying to shape policy opinions in the United States and abroad. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you.
And to all those watching, thank you for watching another episode of Blockchain Policy Matters. I'm Nguyen, founding president of Bitcoin Association. We'll see you next time.